She'd been sleeping beneath his little balcony for 3 weeks, curled into the shadow of the washing line, and then, on a windless night, she came back with a tiny box tied to her collar. It made his hands shake. "You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world." He found her at dawn, as if she and the city had agreed to meet at the same soft hour. The street still held the day's earlier heat in the stone, the kind that smells faintly of dust and lemon oil, but the air itself had a thin clarity, like glass. A sparrow called twice and vanished. The city woke by inhale and exhale. Engines. Vendors setting up, a man with a tea trolley clanging his wares. But around his building the sound was softer, as if people were careful not to wake whatever fragile thing had taken residence in the doorway. She sat where she always sat, just beyond the reach of the hallway light, on the patch of mottled concrete that collected the building's afternoon sun. Her fur, even at this distance, looked like someone had brushed it with shadow. It caught the gray-blue sky and turned it to a soft, burnished color. She lifted her head when she saw him, slow and precise, as if she were listening to the rhythm of his breath. Around her neck, something glinted. It was a small box, not much bigger than a matchbox, wrapped in a strip of faded cloth and knotted with twine. The cloth had pins and an old safety pin, and the twine made a neat loop around the cat's collar, so the box swung gently when she shifted her weight. When she tilted her head, the box clicked softly against her chest. The sound was oddly human, like a heartbeat in miniature. He had not expected that. He had expected hunger. He had expected the usual, a wary approach, a tentative sniff, the economy of a single meow for food. He had not expected a package. He had not expected to feel, briefly and without warning, as though the morning had been folded into something private and given back to him. He crouched without thinking. It felt easier to be small in that moment, to recall what it was to lower the body so a creature would not be afraid. Up close, she was smaller than he'd thought, all bone and muscle. The little hump of her shoulders formed like a question. Her eyes were the color of old pennies, flat and warm. She blinked at him once, slow and sure, and the small box swung. Her whiskers trembled, and he smelled the rain that had been on her coat the night before. That metallic, clean scent of streets, after stormwater moves through them. Underneath that was another scent he couldn't name, a human smell, faint as if washed by a river and left to dry on stones. Soap and tobacco, the memory of someone leaning over a low balcony. He reached out. The pads of his fingers brushed the fur at the top of her neck. It was warm and rough with the dust of night spent under open sky. She did not push away. Instead, she pressed very slightly as if making a small agreement. She let him feel the box through the thin fabric of her collar. The knot had been tied by hands that knew how to be careful. There was a sound then, not a sound of the city, but a sound of something folding into itself. It was the sort of silence that only exists right before a bell rings or someone tells you a secret. He did not know if she wanted him to open it. He only knew he wanted to. He opened the door to the stairwell without a thought for the neighbor who might be watching, or the coffee he had planned for the morning. The stairwell smelled of old paint and a slipper squeak of broom bristles. He carried the cat inside as if he were carrying a book that must not be bent. She settled in his arms with a small sigh, the kind of sigh that says, "This will do." He set her down on the rug. She did not move from his side. The box, still tied, rested against her collar like a secret that had decided to reveal itself only when the room was quiet. The human, he had a name, and names in this story matter because they are anchors. His name was Imran, or he had been. Called Imran in the years before his phone plan changed, and his mother died, and the small, steady certainties of adult life became negotiable, day by day. He had come back from a short hospital stay some months earlier, his shoulder still scarred, where the IV had been placed, and the city had folded around him and left him with a new kind of quiet. He was not lonely in the way of an empty house with echoes. He had friends who called, a job that required his careful hands, a sister with children. But there was a looseness to his evenings now, a section of time that had once been filled by other people's stories and was now a plain table. He liked routine. He liked to water the potted basil on the windowsill and watch the green push new leaves. He liked the way a bowl of lentils simmered, small bubbles like tiny breathing things. He liked to sit with his back to the radiator and read old paperbacks, until the margins became familiar. Now, in the punctured space his mother had left, his routines were small and deliberate. He kept a metal tray for the herbs and a chipped mug for tea, and he kept the balcony door slightly ajar at night so the air would carry the city back in. Between the two of them, the man who hoarded small comforts and the street cat who seemed to carry the city's weather in her fur, there was an unspoken truce. She did not let him pick her up more than once or twice. She accepted food on the step and a cheek rubbed with the knuckle of his thumb. He named her Nim under his breath, one night when the name seemed to fit her like a small hat. He said it quietly, names he thought could be given or found. She responded first to the food, then to the sound of his scratch against her ear. As the day unfolded, he found reasons to watch her. He found in watching a rhythm. Nim would arrive at the end of his shift, as if timing herself to the chime of his tired hands on the keys. She would sit a little distance away, gaze through the thin bar of balcony railing at the other place that smelled of washing soap and the neighbor's laundry, and then, at the sound of him stirring a pot or slipping a spoon into a jar, she would come. Sometimes she would leave for hours, skinning the alleys and hunting the way a small ghost moves through rooms, and then she would return when the orange of sunset made gull shadows on the concrete. The city had edges Nim respected. The bakery where the guard left crusts, the old woman who tossed stale chapati over a wall, the alley where the gutter hid a broken music box. And yet, she always came back to him. He began to mark the days by small things. The way the first rain after the monsoon left the balcony tiles slick and smelling of musk. The time the streetlight with the missing bulb made a square of darkness on his rug that she insisted on sleeping in. The day his sister dropped by with her small son, and he watched the boy's fingers trail along Nim's back in the way that maps the world. With each small passing, there was an accumulation of trust, of habit, of the small, precious sugar of routine. Sometimes, when the news brought bad news about people who ran from cities or found themselves without words for their grief, Nim would sit on his knee and press into him as if marking the place where sorrow was allowed. He would make tea and forget to drink it while he watched the cat breathe. The box on her collar was a new thing in that architecture of smallness. It introduced an element that did not belong to their pattern. For days he did not open it. The eye box made its own soft presence at every mealtime, knocking once against the plaster when she bumped in search of a better sleeping angle. It made a tinny sound in the noon light. He would find himself standing by the doorway, his hand hovering above it, then lowering again as if obeying some rule he did not remember learning. Sometimes he would take it in his palm and turn it over, but the knot was precise and the twine smelled faintly of tobacco and jasmine. There were theories he ran through his head like a rehearsal. Maybe it was a gift from another human, a child's trinket. Maybe someone who nursed her had put something near her collar to mark her as theirs, and she had shaken loose. Maybe it contained a name, the real human name of her family, if she had a family. He imagined the unlikely, the romantic, that she was carrying a lost wedding ring or the last watch of a man who had once loved her and left his life to the gutters. These were fanciful things, but so is the morning light, and for a moment his mind softened into possibility. The building's caretaker, an older man with a cough and hands like paper, watched Nim as well. He offered Imran a story. There had been cats in the neighborhood a long time, he said. Cats that belonged to no one, and yet belonged to everyone. They keep things, he told him once, as if explaining an old custom. They take pieces of the city and carry them around. Maybe they make altars out of our lost things. The caretaker laughed, but his laugh was not without meaning. Around town, older people spoke of cats like that. They told stories over chipped cups of sweet tea about animals that carried messages and returned them to certain doors. Imran wasn't certain he believed in omens. He believed in medicine and appointments and the clarity of lists. Yet the box inserted itself into the days like a note slipped between books. He began to find himself, unmoored in the small hours, skimming the city map and looking at alleys. He watched the way Nim walked the alley behind the bakery, a procession, head low, nose to the ground. He watched how she paused at the same corner of the stairwell, as if listening to something only she could hear. There was an intelligence in her that was not domestic curiosity, but something older. She had the way of a creature who remembers. A city as a sequence of safe and unsafe places. If anything defined those early mornings, it was a feeling like the first breath after you have been underwater. Slow, sharp, the taste of salt vinegar in the throat. He kept thinking of his mother, who would have noticed the box and guessed at its origin. Maybe someone left it, she would have said. Maybe it is from a child. His mother had been the sort of person who looked at small things and assumed stories. She turned minor events into sagas with a single observation and a cup of hot tea. He missed the presence of that habit because it turned the edges of his days into a map of human connection, ironed neat. He fed Nim more than he intended to at first. A bowl of rice with a little chicken stock, bits of cooked fish, the bread, crust she particularly liked. She accepted each offering with a particular etiquette, a quick inhale, a measured bite, an upright tail. When he stroked the fur at the base of her skull, she made a chirruping sound, as if deciding whether to sing. He began to think of the box while he prepared food, and the box began to enter the short list of things he noticed in a day. The basils, leaves curling, the neighbor's television muffled and bright, the exact time the streetlight hummed and the cats came to sit beneath it. He visited the market with a purposeful but secret hope. He asked the fishmonger if he'd lost anything small. He asked the vendor with the shawls if anyone had left a small box. People smiled and made the world as small as it usually was. No, Sahib, we find keys sometimes, wallets never come back. A child pulled a balloon past and laughed, and for an instant Imran almost told the child he was looking for a story. He didn't. When he returned, Nim was waiting on the same patch of concrete, the box swinging like a pendulum against her collar. The smallness of the box made it more significant. It was not loud or ostentatious. It had the economy of something someone had wrapped carefully because there was nothing else to use. Its cloth strip was a remnant, the sort of thing that had belonged to a shirt, the kind of fabric that remembers the body it once covered. Under the strip, the wood was smooth and had been sanded by hands. There was a faint smear of something on one corner, dark and dried. Coffee? Oil? Blood? He could not tell. There was a smell of lavender. Or perhaps that was the memory. Of lavender. The way memory reshapes ordinary scent into a promise. That morning, as the city warmed under an honest sun, he placed the box on the low table by the window. Nim sat beside it and watched him with the stillness of someone who had given the world rules and expected them to be followed. He made himself a cup of tea and did not drink it quickly. The steam fogged the glass, and he watched the way the terrace reflected in the cup like a tiny bright map. There was an impulse to call someone. A friend who liked puzzles, a sister with a steady voice who would tell him not to invent stories. He picked up his phone and put it down. The phone felt too loud for the room. It was the wrong instrument for this kind of attention. He walked to the balcony and leaned his elbows on the railing, feeling the small prickle of dust on his skin. Below, the street moved in slow, familiar currents. An old man walked a skinny dog. A woman in a bright scarf folded sheets into the air. A motorcycle hummed past, scattering birds like thrown coins. He could not shake the sense that this was a hinge moment, not in the way doors open suddenly, but in the way the light folds and a different part of the room is revealed. He thought of the kinds of secrets that come in small boxes. He imagined the box held a photograph, a sepia square with a smiling woman in a dress whose hem matched the cloth around the box. He imagined a child's drawing, a corner folded and stained. He imagined a note written in a hand that trembled and then steadied. These were fantasies. There was also the practical. It could be nothing. It could be a piece of plastic, a child's toy. But even in that small possibility, the box had already altered something inside him. An attentiveness, a willingness to witness. He sat down and waited with the cat as if waiting were a sacrament. Nim stretched and rearranged her paws, then lowered, her head to the floor, and slept. The box pulsed once against her collar when she shifted, a small mechanical heartbeat. Time went like a slow leak. The kettle's whistle far down the street, the crack of a windshield as the market opened, the steady, patient creak of the building. He listened and let the world keep its small, ordinary noises. Opening the box felt like an act of permission. He told himself he would check only if she gave him a sign. He waited for a sign that could be read without imagination. A nudge, a cheer-up, a sudden insistence. What came instead was a faint movement in Nim's tail, a whisper of a twitch that passed like a weather shift. He picked up the box with both hands the way you handle an animal that might wake from a dream. The twine bit slightly into his palm, the knot held. When he loosened it, the cloth slid softly. Inside was not what his mind had been rehearsing or what the caretaker's myths predicted. It was a folded piece of paper, and tucked beneath it a dried sprig of marigold. The paper was not more than a square, yellowed at the edges as if it had been kept folded for a long time. The handwriting, when he unfolded it with fingers that trembled despite himself, was small and precise. There were 2 lines written, in a hand that could have belonged to a woman who wrote letters and kept small records. For when you need to find me. A. He read the lines 3 times, like a child learning a lesson by repetition. The initials were a question mark. The marigold crumbled at the edges, leaving a dust-like sunlight in his palms. He smelled faintly the perfume of something foreign and familiar. The paper did not say more. It did not explain how the box had come to be tied to Nim's collar or who A might be. It did not tell him why a cat would be tasked with carrying a message across streets and time. Outside the window, a delivery truck rattled by and a child laughed. The city resumed. But inside the small room, there was a stillness that had the shape of a held breath. He had expected, perhaps foolishly, for the box to settle the mystery, to place a tidy bow on the days that had been drifting. Instead, it opened a new one. The name, a single initial, suggested a story that was not finished. It suggested a human presence beyond the alley, a life that had left a breadcrumb in a cat's collar and trusted that someone would notice. He put the paper and the marigold back into the little box and wrapped the twine the way it had been tied. Careful, precise, like a promise whispered at night. Nim watched him with calm, her eyelids half lowered in the domestic way cats have, when they are content but alert. Then she jumped onto the windowsill as if to mark the agreement, and with a single decisive motion, she pushed the box with her paw until it fell to the floor and came to rest near his slippers. It felt like an offering. Not the grand kind, not a revelation shouted from a rooftop. Rather, the modest, intimate kind that arrives at your foot and asks to be accepted. He did not know, not in any language the city taught him, how to receive such a gift. He stood there for a long time, his hands empty, the box at his slipper like a small altar. The day outside opened fully into afternoon. Shadows lengthened, and the building's thin light shifted. At some point he realized he had been holding his breath and let it go. He looked at Nim, and for the first time he felt not simply like a man with a stray cat on his balcony, but like someone who had been given a role in a story that had been going on while he'd been busy arranging his life into lists. The cat was not simply a creature of needs, she was a courier of almost human gentleness, connecting him to an unknown other. The box had changed the geometry of his days. It had widened the small life he led into something with a backstory. A beginning had started then, not with the resolution of a puzzle but with the discovery of one. It moved through the room like a beam of light cutting a dust mote. Undeniable, moderate, precise. The city continued to do what cities do. People bought fruit, arguments began and ended at the tea stall, a motorbike stalled, and a man cussed. And yet inside the apartment there was a new cadence. The rhythm of the room had a note that was now keyed to the box. He could not imagine what would come next. He only knew he would wake in the middle of the night thinking of a hand that had once tied twine around a cat's collar, a hand that had folded a note small and neat. As the sun lowered, the thought of moving, of packing up the little life he had stitched together for the month since the hospital, took on a new weight. The box suggested continuity, something that resisted erasure. If he left the building, would that be stealing the story from the person who left the note? Did Nim belong to someone? And had she been sent with a map in the form of a paper square and a flower? Or had she chosen him as the only person who might understand how to receive such a fragile thing? He sat with these questions and let them settle without pressing them for answers. The morning had begun with a gift. The gift had been modest and exacting, and left a half-illumination where before there had been only routine. He closed the balcony door, and as the lock clicked, he felt that the day had swum its first meaningful length. Something had started. Not a drama, not a tidy resolving of grief, but a soft door opening inward. The tiny box on the rug was the hinge. The cat, asleep in a sun rectangle, breathed slow and even. He walked to the kitchen and filled a bowl with warm water, and when he returned, she was awake, looking at him with a city in her eyes, as if asking only one thing. "Will you follow this?" He did not know how to answer. He only knew that he would not refuse. And so the morning closed around the small promise of the box. A promise that there were stories in the city that would not be found on billboards or in newspapers, but in the quiet of someone's doorstep and the loop of twine around a collar. It felt like the beginning of being noticed, not in the way of being interrupted by life, but being invited into it. The cat lifted her head, rubbed against his ankle, and together they sat in the small room where the day's ordinary music resumed. He folded his hands and the box lay between them like an unspoken question. Something had begun. Days folded into each other like pages. They were not marked by anything grand, no headline, no ceremony, just small ordinary calibrations that, when stitched together, became a life. Imran began to notice times. The exact minute the street vendor rolled his cart past with metal clinking. The thin hour in the afternoon when the light through the stairwell made a clean square on the apartment floor. The way the old man downstairs would whistle a tune that sounded like a question, and Nim would answer with a chirrup from the landing. He learned the cadence of small things the way a musician learns a phrase, with repetition until it is muscle. The ritual of arrival was the first pattern. Nim came at the same uncertain hour each evening, often just as the sun thinned into the shadows of the opposite building. She would appear on the landing as if she had been standing in the doorway of the city, watching the light change. She moved with a particular economy, an economy learned on streets where every step matters. Her paws struck the concrete softly. Her tail had the patient sway of someone counting beats. When she reached his door, she would pause on the threshold and look back toward the stairwell as if making sure no one else wanted her tonight. Then she would slip in. He left the door ajar. It was small courtesy and small control. He would be at the sink or by the balcony with the plant and hear the click of her claws and the tiny, almost imperceptible jingle of the twine against the ring of her collar. That sound, first incidental, became a herald. It made him straighten, like a man who hears a familiar voice calling his name across a market. Food arrived as palate and invitation. He learned what she liked and what she tolerated. Rice soaked in lentil broth became a ritual offering on certain evenings. A strip of fish, blushed soft in the hot pan, was saved like an indulgence. He would offer, and she would accept with manners, a single sniff, a tiny bite, a pause, then a measured return to the dish. Sometimes she ate at a pace that suggested she was savoring the act of being fed by one person. Sometimes she left a crumb or two as if keeping a reserve for later in the night. The simple economy of her eating taught him patience. He began to feel his own hunger in relation to another being's. He watched how she slept. Cats have their private geography of slumber. Nim chose the thin strip of sun that moved across the living room in the afternoon. She flattened her limbs in a small compact, tucking paws into fur. When she slept, her jaw moved slightly, a tiny chewing motion as if she were continuing a pleasant thought. The sound of her breathing was minimal. A little airplane hum. The note of a machine that keeps steady time. Once, when he stooped to trace the line of her back, he found himself weeping, not loud or dramatic, a small private leak that he wiped away with the back of his wrist. He had not expected such a physical response to a creature who chose him with such quiet. There were storms. When the monsoon finally rolled in, the city changed its voice. Rain drummed on the terrace and the gutters gurgled. The smell of wet earth and oil rose up into the room. The basil leaves on the sill glistened with beads of water. Nim would stay close to the threshold, framed in the doorway like a shadowed sentinel, watching the rain with a kind of scrutiny that made him laugh out loud once, absurdly. She did not like to be rained on. She disliked the way the drops smacked against her coat and left a trailing scent of the streets. But rain made her stay longer at the apartment. She liked the domestic heat that followed, the warmth that soaked into floor tiles. On those nights, she would fold into his feet when he sat reading, a weight that anchored him to the present. He began leaving windows cracked, a small concession that invited the outside world in and let Nim come and go in the manner of a guest with privileges. He found himself arranging cushions and small blankets in places she favored. A worn shawl on the low chair became her afternoon bed. A folded towel on the balcony was for the nights when she wanted to catch the breeze. These were small, almost accidental acts. He did them because it felt correct to prepare a place for her, the same way he had once prepared cups of tea for visitors. He had learned, in other lives, how to make a house hospitable. Now he did it for a very particular presence. They developed a language of gestures. He would make a soft rasping sound at the back of his throat, and she would answer with a half meow. He learned to move slowly when she was near, to avoid sudden gestures that startle a creature used to the street's quickness. If he passed too quickly, she would lift her head and watch him go with what felt like reproach. On mornings when his chest felt close with old grief, Nim would choose the seat near his knees, sit with the deliberate grace of someone offering company, and look at him as if counting the number of breaths he had taken that day. The cat taught him how to be small in public. He stopped making long, loud plans and instead arranged the day into manageable parts. A letter to reply to, a walk to the corner store, washing the dishes. These were not concessions to fear. They were gestures of attentiveness. The things that previously felt urgent had shifted into a softer category. There was an intimacy in waiting for a cat to return that made him more attentive to the textures of his own life. The city, which had once been a backdrop to his survival, transformed into the set of a story where small kindnesses mattered. He started checking on her even on days when he planned to be away. He would place a little bowl near the door filled with water and a few morsels, not because he believed she couldn't find food, but because it felt wrong not to leave a small courtesy. He would run his finger along the rim of the bowl, imagining the warmth of her tongue, and smile at the thought. Once he forgot, and when he returned, the rug was dotted with paw prints like punctuation. He laughed and washed the floor, feeling guilty and pleased at the same time. There were small reconciliations with neighbors. People who had once ignored the quiet man with the metal tray and the basil became aware of Nim. A woman in the building who kept pigeons began to leave a stale crust near the stairwell for the cat. An old man in the lane called out, Give her extra tonight, as if he were instructing a friend. These were micro-alliances. The city, in its accumulation of little acts, seemed to respond to the presence of a creature who asked for nothing but companionship. The box on her collar, the little matchbox-sized parcel he had opened the morning they first met, remained an altar of curiosity. He tucked it away in the drawer with his small things. A fountain pen his father had once used, a chipped coin from a trip he had taken years ago, a ticket stub from a film he had loved. Sometimes he would take the box out and look at the single, folded square of paper and the fragile marigold. The note, 2 lines and an initial, became a private knot he worried with his thumb. It was an invitation and a question, and it made him look outward in ways he hadn't planned. There were visitors he did not expect. A girl from the building's top floor who worked nights as a nurse came by once with a thermos and a soft smile. She had seen Nim in the stairwell for weeks and had a story of her own, a time years ago when a cat saved her by refusing to leave her hospital bed until a doctor checked on her. She spoke quietly, as if the room itself might overhear. They shared tea and swapped small confessions, the kind that happen when 2 people meet around the subject of an animal. He found that the cat was quietly a social bridge. People who once passed with eyes averted now lingered briefly to trade small observations. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you even when you didn't ask them to?" she asked him one evening, the question like a pebble dropped into still water. He considered. The question. He thought of his mother waiting up late for him when he returned home from college, the nightlight in the kitchen and the kettle still warm. He thought of a childhood dog who would lie in the hall until he came back from school. But this was different. Nim's waiting was not the simple loyalty of blood or household. It felt chosen and careful. He answered slowly, "Not like this." His voice sounded thin with surprise. The girl nodded, as if she understood that different kinds of waiting make different footprints on a life. Trust arrived as a series of small escalations. The first time he was allowed to pick her up without protest, he felt like someone who had been handed a fragile relic. She permitted him to lift her once, with the deference of a creature testing a hypothesis, whether he would be steady. He cradled her as if holding water. She tolerated it for a while, then turned her head and licked the crease of his wrist with a small feline insistence. The sensation of that tongue on his skin was startlingly intimate. It carried the taste of street dust and the electric after-odor of rain, and it lodged a small warmth under his ribs. There were evenings when she would follow him into the small room he kept as an office. He would sit at the table, open his laptop, and her silhouette would pass across the screen like a quiet truth. She liked to be near sound, the hum of the computer, the scratch of a pen on paper. Sometimes she would watch him work with a tilt of her head that suggested curiosity, not impatience. He imagined she watched the light on the screen and the way his fingers moved. It seemed to him that Nim calibrated her trust by the steadiness of his movements. Sleep became gentler. He began to leave a small blanket on the foot of his bed. One night, when sleep was thin and his thoughts scattered, he woke to a pressure against his calf and found Nim there, stretched in the faint crescent of light from the window. She had made herself entirely comfortable and had lit a steady warmth where the emptiness of his nights used to be. For the first time in months, he slept without waking, buoyed by the small, untranslatable assurance of another body near his own. He learned to read her silences. Cats carry a language in their stillness. There was the look of intense curiosity when she watched a moth circle a lamp. There was the flick of tail that meant annoyance. There were the long, slow blinks, that soft, unguarded sign cats give when they feel safe enough to close part of their vigilance. The more he observed, the more he could anticipate her moves. He could tell from the way she positioned her ears whether she had been on the roof. He could tell, by the faint grit in her paw pads, whether she had been near the river. He began to document the city in her traces. A small private crisis tested the bond. One week, a stray dog began to patrol the lane, a large animal with the loose energy of hunger. Neighbors muttered about noise and safety, and the dog chased pigeons and sometimes bared its teeth at Nim. The first night the dog came around, he watched from his window with a surge of panic that made his hands go cold. Nim, for her part, did not retreat. She chose instead to sit on the step and stare the dog down the way one holds a line in a long conversation. Her small body made no threat. She simply refused to be hurried. Imran went downstairs. He felt clumsy heroics set in motion in his chest. He yelled at the dog, which is always an awkward thing, the sound of a man trying to outrun an animal's appetite with poor vocal technique. The dog, more surprised than wounded, slunk away. Neem never looked at him as if to say thank you. She looked at him later that night and made a faint noise like a roll of small marbles. He understood that she had not needed saving. She had wanted the presence of someone who recognized her right to be there. He realized in that instant that his protective instincts weren't about dominance. They were about standing witness. He felt embarrassingly like a guardian who had been apprenticed by a creature who needed nothing but acknowledgement. There were days of fragility. Once he misread the schedule and came home hours later than he planned. When he opened the door, Nim was not there. He called her name like a child calling for a mother in an empty house. The apartment felt suddenly too big. He walked the block twice. The vendors had seen her. They pointed toward the alley near the bakery where, it turned out, she had been playing with a child who fed her scraps. The relief when he found her curled on an old newspaper near the stall was physical. His chest unclenched as if a muscle had loosened. She greeted him with a look that said simply, "You were late, I waited." The reproach was suffused with love. Those small storms and reconciliations built something like intimacy. It did not announce itself. It accumulated like leaves, filling a gutter until suddenly the river had risen. He found himself telling small things aloud he'd never said to anyone. A complaint about a coworker, the pleasure of a particular bus route, the memory of his father teaching him to fix a leaking tap. He did not expect the cat to understand. He understood that she could not decode language in the human sense. Yet saying things with the cat underfoot made them lighter, as if spoken into cotton. He began to keep small things in reach that he thought might matter to her. Soft balls, a ribbon, an empty cardboard tube from the grocery. She favored simple pleasures. A wadded paper gave her hours of entertainment. She played briefly and precisely, then abandoned the toy in favor of sunbeams. He watched how she made play into ritual. She pounced like she was practicing a role. The precision of her movement, the slight tuck of hind legs, the tilt of her head, made him absurdly proud. On some afternoons, children from the building's courtyard would come to watch. They made a quiet community theater around Nim, a chorus of whispers and small gasps. One child taught her to chase a string with an earnest concentration that made the adults laugh. In his presence, Nim moderated her daring. She took the hands of children gently, allowing them to stroke and sometimes to hug. There was a softness in the way she allowed touch that never invited ownership, only participation. The neighborhood took notice. People began to mark the time of their day by her visits. Her presence, tiny at first, became a predictable comfort that threaded the building together. He also began to watch the way she navigated the moral geography of the city. Cats hold boundaries differently than humans do. Nim respected certain places and avoided others. She ignored a particular doorway where, it turned out, a man was cruel to pigeons. She avoided the shadowed stairwell where a late-night caller loitered. She liked the bakery's back alley because a woman there often hummed to herself as she kneaded dough. These were not mere habits. They were ethical maps. The city spoke through her feet, and in attending to her, Imran began to learn the city as a sequence of moral coordinates. Their mornings took on a gentle cadence. He would make tea. He would open the balcony and let the light in. She would appear on the sill and watch the street, ears twitching at the sound of early engines. Sometimes she would jump to the radiator and circle once before settling. He would water the basil and feel small green shoots between his fingers, and she would brush past his ankles as if approving the movement. The small world they shared was ordered and softening. Time, which can harden the edges of a human's life, became pliant around the creature's ease. There was tenderness in routine. It built in the most mundane moments. The ritual of cleaning, small dishes after her meal, the way he would fold a towel and set it on the chair she liked, the quiet pleasure of seeing her nose press into the warmth of a cushion. He began to find joy in repetition. Where once monotony would have dulled him, it now felt like a long, low hymn. Then came the small, quiet surprise that changed the tenor of their bond in a way he hadn't expected. It was an ordinary night. He had eaten without thinking, a meal, assembled more by habit than hunger. The heater clicked on and off in a rhythm his body had learned to sleep to. The city outside shushed into deeper tones. He was sitting on the sofa, a book open but read just by the line, lost in the husk of his thoughts. Nim was on her cushion, the soft shawl he had folded for her, legs tucked and eyes half closed. He felt a movement at his feet, a small scrape of claws on the rug. He looked down in that absent way one does when waking suddenly. Nim was there, standing beneath the coffee table, head tilted up, looking straight at him. Her eyes were full, like little polished coins in which the room's light caught. She meowed, a thin, plaintive sound he had learned to answer to. He set the book down and reached for her. She did not jump into his lap like she sometimes did, nor did she stretch and roll in the convincing lengths of a cat needing attention. Instead, with the solemnity of someone making a decision, she slipped forward, pressed her body against his ankle, and let out another small sound. Then she began to climb. It was not a leap. It was not the acrobatic motion cats usually employ, to claim a place on a human's torso. She used his legs like stairs. She went foot by foot, with that deliberate, careful pace of someone who is being careful with a fragile object. When she reached his knees, she paused. He held his breath, a silly, involuntary thing that left him feeling foolish for being so affected by a small animal's movement. She continued. She hopped gently into his lap, then climbed the rest of the way up his chest and, with a fluid, nearly indecipherable motion, curled herself against his throat. Her weight was small but exacting. She tucked her paws under and folded her tail over. The scent of the marigold, faint and dry, clung to her fur and rose like a memory. For a moment he could only feel the steady cadence of her breath and the tiny pressure of her body against his neck. Her eyes closed and the slow, rhythmic motion of her sleep began. He felt, in that small contact, a release of something tight across his chest. Tears came again, warm and surprising. They were not the grief of other nights. These were finer. They were the spill of relief and recognition. She had broken a boundary no one had asked her to cross. She had chosen the most vulnerable place on his body, the throat, the place where a human breathes time, and laid herself there as if to say, "I trust you with this small thing." She had never done this before. Not in all the weeks of shared meals and radiators. The move was not theatrical. It was quiet and precise, and had the humility of a person placing a hand on your heart and staying. He stayed very still. He did not reach to stroke her right away. He felt the honor of the gesture like a sacred object handed between two people. He let the moment sit with him, thick and luminous. The subtlest of shifts, the lean of her head, the softened shape of her ears, delivered an emotional ledger he had not been expecting. Alone in the apartment with the murmuring city, he felt less solitary than he had in months. When finally he dared to move, he laid his palm on the curve of her back. Her fur was rough in places and silky in others. The precise contrast jolted him. The city in her scruff. The softness of the places that had been touched. She answered the touch with a small, contented trill and shifted to nuzzle the crook of his jaw. That was her final intimate punctuation. It was as if she said, "There is no hurry. There is no need to mend. Sit with me." He understood in that chest-quiet moment that trust is not dramatic. It is not a declaration. It is a choice repeated in tiny actions. Climbing a human's lap at night, sleeping on a throat like a tiny talisman, allowing a hand to rest on a body that has room for the world's aches. He had been given an extraordinary liberty, the permission to be seen in his tenderest state. The surprise ended with a settling. She slept as if the world had been put right. He moved slowly to make tea, the familiar work feeling like prayer. When he returned with the mug, Nim did not stir. He sat with the warmth on his palms and watched her breathe. He traced the line of the marigold's dry petals when the light caught them and thought of the small note and the initial A. He wondered who had trusted a cat to be a courier of such a fragile thing. He thought of the hand that had wrapped the twine and the person who must have hoped that somewhere, somehow someone would notice. That night, with the cat on his chest, he slept the way the city sleeps after a storm. Slow, forgiven, and ordinary in the best of ways. The world outside continued its noisy commerce. Inside, they had built an inner weather that cushioned the edges of grief and left in the morning a new shape for the day. The small surprise, Nim laying herself against his throat, was more than an escalation of trust. It was a quiet confession. It redrew the lines of their relationship, from tentative arrangements to a shared, unspeaking companionship. It changed the way he moved around the apartment, the slight care he took when he shifted, the way he checked his phone less, and the way he listened to the street. It was, without fanfare, a binding. He did not know if it meant she would stay. Cats, by nature, are itinerant, and the city offers many anchoring points. He only knew that in that moment she had chosen him as a harbor. The next morning he woke with the faint impression of her paw in his hair and a lighter heart. He made tea, and before anything else, offered her a small piece of fish. She ate, then rubbed her head against his wrist in a movement that felt like gratitude. It was, he realized, a gentle promise. They both kept it. For a while, the box was a small, private thing, a folded square of paper and a crumbled marigold that lived in his drawer like a little relic. Then the pattern changed. The change arrived not like a storm, but like a single misplaced stitch that set a seam unraveling. Nim began to bring him things. The first one was so modest he almost missed it. He found it one morning by the shoe rack, a little thing tucked against the wall where dust gathered. A single black button with a tiny thread still looped through one hole, like a heart with a pulse. He picked it up on instinct and turned it in his fingers. It was warm from being in someone's pocket or being chewed by rain. Nim was on the balcony, head up, watching him with that steady, bright gaze. He set the button on the table and felt the beginnings of a question rise in him. The second morning there was a different offering. A small, bent safety pin, tarnished, tucked carefully beneath the plant pot. The third was a scrap of ribbon the exact shade of blue the nurse on the top floor wore. He began to make a list, not the practical kind he used for groceries, but a list of small thefts the city makes of itself. Buttons, pins, ribbons, a child's plastic ring that had once been pink and was now the color of old sugar. Each item had the economy of a sentence. Each item was placed in the same corner, arranged with a cat's sense of design. A small tidy pile near his slippers, as if left on the doorstep of memory. He could have treated these objects as curiosities and left them at that. He did not. The box had already taught him to treat small things as if they were signals. He began to keep the pile, arranging items by size and sometimes by color. The presence of objects made him pay attention to the ways the city shed itself. He noticed where puddles gathered and which drains the rats avoided. He learned the name of the market vendor who wore a watch with a cracked face, and the seamstress who kept her needle under a glass jar. He asked small questions. People answered with the easy evasions of those who don't want to admit the city has a secret life they are only peripherally part of. There was method to Nim's offerings. Not every day produced a gift, but the gestures fell into a rhythm. She walked the alleys like a courier with a route. Sometimes she left things at the base of the staircase as if assembling a map. Other times she took items from the street and kept them, only to return them in the morning as if testing his watchfulness. The small pile grew and began to suggest patterns that were invisible to everyone else. He started to look for them. To look, not with a detective's grandiosity, but with the tiny obsession of someone who has begun to live for the surprise of a small reveal. With each new object, the emotional stakes changed. The man who had learned to be content with small routines found his days layered with speculation. Every time he opened his door, there was a small hope. Would there be an item today? What story did it tell? He began to read meaning into the smallest things. A child's sticker with a cartoon elephant suggested that Nim had visited a playground. A faded bus ticket suggested she had passed the intersection near the cinema. A brass key, small as a promise, suggested a locked thing somewhere. The key unsettled him the way certain unanswered questions lodge into your throat. It was not ornate. It had the anonymity of a key from a cheap lock, and yet its teeth were clean, as if someone had polished it recently. He turned the key over again and again, feeling the weight of the metal. He smelled it and imagined the pocket it had come from. Imran began to ask where exactly keys came from and whether someone might be walking around missing a small lock. The neighborhood shrugged with its habitual pragmatism. "People lose things," the vendor said. "They lose everything." But Imran kept the key, and it sat beside the box in the drawer like an appendage of the mystery. There were nights when Nim refused to come inside. She would sit on the threshold, eyes fixed on a dark point in the street, her tail wrapped tight like a rope. He could feel the teeth of worry tighten in his chest. Sometimes she would slip away, leaving the door open and the kettle cooling. Those were the nights he would go to the window and watch the lane with the hunger of someone waiting for a small miracle. The city at night had a different grammar. It breathed in cool, low tones of exhaust and wet stone and the distant music of a shopkeeper sweeping. Through those breaths, Nim walked. She traveled without hurry, stopping at specific corners, pausing to look up at balconies. When she returned, the items she brought seemed heavier, charged with an intention Imran could not translate. As the piles accumulated, his curiosity became less passive. He started to follow her sometimes, stepping softly into the alleys after she had already gone. He moved with a clumsy discretion, balancing on the edge of feeling intrusive and feeling compelled. The night walk was a different city entirely. Shadows stretched long and took on intimate shapes, where the daytime bustle became a softer secret. Nim moved like a ghost with purpose, tail a slow metronome. She paused at a drain, at a closed shop, at a patch of uneven pavement where pigeons fed in the early light. Once she paused in front of a closed gate and stared at it for minutes, as if listening for a sound beyond the metal. The first time he followed her into that gate, he found himself at the back of an old compound where children used to play and where a woman now hung laundry so meticulously it looked like flags. Nim did not show him the way inside. She sat on the wall and watched him watch her. He felt foolish then, like someone who had been taught a secret handshake and fumbled the clap. He laughed at himself and came back home with the small satisfaction of having tried. He found, in following her, that he felt less alone. That the act of curiosity itself was a corrective to the loneliness that had lived in his ribs. A neighbor, the nurse from the top floor, noticed his following and asked a question that made him hesitate. A small, soft test. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" she said, cutting a conversation like a thread. She had a way of asking that made his answer sound like more than a statement. He looked at her for a long beat and then said, "I think they do." It was not a philosophical stance. It was an admission. He had moments now when he thought his loneliness had been a map waiting for another body to trace its lines with him. He began to believe that the cat knew more than most people. One afternoon, Nim brought something that made his hand shake slightly when he picked it up. It was a tiny photograph corner, not more than a sliver, with the shadowed edge of a face, and the navy of a uniform. The paper was old, the image faded to the softness of memory. He held it up to the light. There was the curve of a cheek, a collar, the hint of a smile. The marigold's dust tickled his fingers as though it were a reminder to pay attention to the small things. That night he took the sliver of photo to the market. He asked the vendor who fixed watches whether anyone in the neighborhood had lost a photograph. He showed the scrap to the seamstress and to the boy who shined shoes. People smiled and told stories. Someone mentioned an old tailor who kept a trunk of photographs, but he had died years ago. the search drifted into myth. The more people told him a version of the town's secret lives, the more stubbornly Imran wanted a real answer. He wanted a human story, something with a beginning and an end, not the kind of folklore that solves nothing. His own life began to press against the edges of this new obsession. For months, a job abroad had been offered, a small certain thing that would lift him out of the city's rhythms in exchange for a financial cushion and the possibility of starting again. The offer was real enough, and yet the thought of leaving became suddenly more complicated. What would it mean to step into the steady possibility of work elsewhere while a small life was mapping westward through his doorway? He found himself stalled. On the one hand was a practical route out of the sticky places. On the other was a delicate, unnameable responsibility to the creature who had chosen him, and to the unknown person whose life Nim kept collecting in small gestures. He began to imagine scenarios in which he left and the box went with him, or in which the cat stopped coming and the secret was never solved. The idea of that tiny story, a handful of objects like breadcrumbs, being left to rot in some corner of the city, felt like a betrayal of the tenderness Nim had offered. It was absurd, perhaps, to imagine such global consequences from the placement of a ribbon or a key. But grief and gratitude, he had learned, make for strange geometries in the heart. The presence of Nim and her gifts reframed his choices into moral dilemmas that felt, in their way, sacred. In the middle of one week, the pattern shifted again. Nim brought something that was not small, not at all, but not big so much as intimate and sharp. It was a child's paper wristband, the kind hospitals or community centers use, printed with a name in block letters. The name was partially smudged, but enough of it remained to give him a clue. Am. The letters matched the initial on the note in the box. He stared at the wristband until his eyes prickled. The match could have been coincidence. It could have been a trick of the mind. The human tendency to stitch together meaning from randomness. Yet the pairing felt too precise to be random. He began to sense, in the way a weather vane first twitches before a storm, that the cat's habits had purpose. She was not collecting at random. She was forming a language he had only just begun to decode. The items were intimate tokens, fragments of a life that someone wanted to send or keep safe. He thought of the folded paper in the box with the single initial A. He thought of marigold dust in the corners of drawers. He imagined a person left with only the ability to fold a note and a blossom, and the conviction that a cat might be a better messenger than a stranger. The next gift changed everything. It was not an object so much as a sound at first, the kind of soft noise that is more felt than heard, the scrape of cloth or the click of a lid. He found it on the balcony at dawn, a small sealed envelope, the kind that holds a quarter-sized coin in some old habit or a pressed leaf. He picked it up with reverence. The envelope bore a careful hand, and the seal had been made with wax the color of crushed berries. On the outside, in an even hand, were 2 words. For Imran. His name. It was not just an initial or a letter, folded small. It was his name written by someone who knew how the world of small courtesies works. His chest tightened in a way that made his breath shallow and quick. The morning's light fell on the envelope like a spotlight. Everything else in the room receded. He felt suddenly like a person who had been assigned to hold a secret and was being trusted with the next step. He tore the envelope open like someone who had waited for a summons. Inside was a single page, folded several times. The handwriting was a woman's, small and neat. There was no flourish, no drama. It began with a sentence that read like a confession. "If you find this, it means she trusted you." Beneath that, in lines that did not ask but implied, were fragments that sketched the outline of a life. References to a street that smelled of wet ink and onions, a small house with laundry lines, a child who once had a laugh like a bell, a man who left and a woman who waited. The letter did not provide closure. It offered small pieces like tiles. It was up to the reader to reassemble them. Halfway through this part of the story, at the moment where the letter's sentences began to feel like the push of tidewater, he paused and addressed the listener, because this is a time when one must ask for small courtesies to be returned. If this gentle story brought even a tiny smile or calm to your heart, would you consider subscribing? It helps me keep sharing these soft moments for you and for anyone who needs peace tonight. The line settled into the room like a small bell. He folded the page and refolded it as if mapping the steps of an unfamiliar dance. The letter contained a name at the bottom, an initial again, but this time with a full stop. A. The same as the tiny note in the box. The repetition felt like a clue tied around a wrist. It felt like the first clean stitch in a fabric of clues. It made the world comprehensible in the particular dangerous way that clues do. They make you want to follow. He took the letter out into the street, because secrets have weight that needs air. The city, midday, was a barrage of sound. Children shouted across a lane. Someone announced fruit from a high cart. A radio blared from a balcony. He walked to the bakery, the seamstress, the shop that sold loose thread, and showed them the page. A few people nodded, one or two became animated, but no one had the whole picture. People are custodians of fragments and nothing more. He felt the small ache of that familiar phenomenon. Everyone holds a piece. No one holds the whole. That night, Nim behaved differently. She was skittish in the evening, more so than before. She prowled the thresholds with that tight, alert energy that made him feel like a man standing near a cliff. He cooked and left food outside the door because it felt like a way of saying thank you to an animal who had been a conduit of something not yet understood. He barely slept, his imagination lit with possibilities and fears. If the letter's fragments were true, then someone was using Nim as a courier because she could cross boundaries where humans could not. But why? Who was this A? Why involve a cat at all? He began to imagine darker possibilities. Maybe Nim was taking things from people who did not deserve them. Maybe the gifts were stolen. Maybe they were tokens of love, left by someone who could not approach a doorstep and thus used a small body to pass things like confessions. The moral line blurred. He found himself constructing justifications for theft and forgiveness with equal fervor. The city, always capable of cruelty, was also full of people who knew how to hold sorrow discreetly. Imran decided, finally, to watch closely. He set up small observations. He stayed on the balcony with a cup of tea as if practicing patience. He kept the door ajar and the light soft. He left a notepad on the table and wrote the date, a human attempt to mark moments in time. When Nim returned, she left another item, a small scrap of fabric with a button pattern he had not seen before. He matched it to a blouse he'd once seen across the lane at the tailor's window, but the seamstress had never mentioned losing it. The things were becoming more personal, less random. The invisible connection between Nim and some other life had tightened into a rope he could feel when he brushed his fingers across it. One night he followed her again, more determined than before. She left the safety of familiar alleys and led him deeper, into a part of the city where buildings clustered close and shadows pooled like listening things. He kept his distance, part human respect and part fear of being the kind of person who intrudes upon the private acts of others. She moved with that steady, patient confidence she always had, but now there was an urgency to her steps, a surety that suggested a goal. He trailed behind, silent, trying to measure the spaces between her pads and the ground. She stopped at a corner where a narrow lane split into two. There was a white-painted door he'd never noticed before, a door with peeling lacquer and a brass number half obscured by dust. Nim paused there and looked at the door with a sort of pleading stare. She sniffed the crack beneath and then sat back on her haunches and began to clean a paw. As if being watched were its own ritual, she waited for something else to happen. Imran stepped closer. He wanted to put his palm on the door and feel the lives behind it. He wanted to knock and ask the simple human question of all mysteries. Who? The urge was sharp and vocal. He pressed his knuckles to the wood with the impulse of a person about to perform a small, courageous act. For a long moment, nothing happened. The city breathed around him. Somewhere a radio played an old love song. Then a shadow moved behind the linen curtain that filled the window to the left. A shape, slight and careful, bent as if to place a cloth in the sink. He heard a voice, so low it might have been a memory. Nim. The name was a surprised bubble. He had not known it was possible to hear the exact syllables. The sound felt like a key turning in a lock. Nim stood and padded to the threshold. For the first real time, a human voice responded to her on the outside. Someone was speaking to her by name. The air thickened in a way that made his chest tight. He felt both elated and afraid. The possibility that Nim belonged to someone, that she had been a courier between two lives, filled him with a complicated tenderness. But it also made him feel like a man on the brink of losing a harbor he had grown into. The question of belonging, suddenly, came with a sharpness he had not suspected. He crouched behind a low trash bin, pressed his palm to the warm metal, and waited. A pair of feet padded at the threshold. Bare, quick, the cadence of someone who might be homeless or someone home. The curtain fluttered, and a door opened just a crack. The scent of jasmine hit him, the same fragrance he had smelled faintly on the box's twine the first morning. A hand reached out and placed a small bowl on the step. It was an act so ordinary and perfect that he felt almost guilty for witnessing. The hand was older, fingers ink-stained like a writer or a seamstress. The wrist bore a thin bracelet with little beads that chimed together the way a wristband does, a familiar kind of music. The person did not step outside. They just set the bowl down and murmured something like, "Go on, girl." Nim approached, sniffed and then turned and, with a movement that felt like ceremony, pressed her head against the hand for a fraction of a second before stepping away. Imran wanted to call out. He wanted to ask who they were and why they had used a cat to ferry pieces of a life. He wanted, with the naked selfishness of someone attached to a small part of the world, to insist that Nim stay. But when he opened his mouth, a sound like a child's footstep echoed down the lane and someone crossed into view, quick and light. He froze. The moment had dissolved like mist. When the person finally stepped into the dim light beyond the door, Imran saw a silhouette nothing like he had imagined. The figure was slight and bent with the care of someone who had kept their shoulders braced against weather for a long time. Their hair was cropped close, and their clothes hung like chapters of a story. They moved with the economy of a person who had learned to measure every motion. Nim met them without hesitation and dropped something at their feet. A small fold. Of fabric he recognized. The ribbon in the nurse's hair. The button from the first morning. The figure picked it up and held it as if handling scripture. For a moment the alley thinned to a narrow strip of meaning. There was a conversation of gestures. The person spoke softly and Nim answered with a trill. Then they bent, and without turning, seemed to slip back into the house. The door shut with the subdued sound of daily life continuing. Imran exhaled and felt like someone who had been holding their breath for an hour. He had been close to the secret, and it had remained partly closed. He wanted to cross the threshold and ask questions that might break whatever fragile arrangement existed there. The cliff here is not a dramatic one with a shout or a revelation. It is the small, soaring drop of the precise moment a mystery shifts, from being possible to being imminent. He stepped forward and pressed his ear to the door as if sound could tell him everything. He heard the faint clack of a sewing machine. A lullaby drifted, the kind the nurse on the top floor hummed sometimes when she was out of sight. Imran's hand hovered over the knob. He could have knocked. He should have knocked. Instead, he retreated to the dark, feeling both the ache of curiosity and the ache of having been given an intimacy he hadn't earned. That night he lay awake, the apartment quiet except for the whisper of the fan. He thought of the marigold, of the folded paper, of a single initial repeated like a pattern on a fabric. The city has its own long memory and it files things in strange places, he thought. He imagined the person beyond the door, perhaps mending fabric, perhaps writing small notes and tying them to strings, perhaps someone who trusted a cat more than people. The thought both soothed and aggravated him. He could not tell whether the mystery was a puzzle to be solved or a story to be revered. When morning came, Nim was at his door as usual, calm and indifferent to the night's drama. She left another small thing on the threshold, a sliver of ribbon with the letters AM printed faintly on it. He picked it up and felt the world's weight again, the sense that he had been invited into a story but had not yet been given permission to pry. The story tightened around a single idea, like the closing of a hand around a small bird. He had to know. He wanted to know. He felt the gravity to step forward and ask, to cross the line between curiosity and interference. He told himself a dozen reasons for restraint. He told himself that some stories are meant to remain half-told. He told himself also that some mysteries are cruel when left incomplete. Unable to sleep another night while questions skimmed like moths against his mind, Imran made a decision he knew might change everything. He would not remain behind the trash bin where he had watched the previous night. He would knock. He would introduce himself. He would ask politely, and if he was turned away, he would leave. It seemed a generous plan, one that respected boundaries while honoring the pull to know. He walked down the lane as the dusk lifted the heat from the stones, feeling like someone committing a small transgression. His palms were slightly sweaty. Nim watched him go, with the inscrutable safety of a creature who knows the city and knows when to bring people to the edge of a secret. She watched him until he reached the gate, tail flicking, then turned and vanished into the alley like a thought dissolving in air. He paused at the gate, hand on the knob, and heard music. The soft murmur of the sewing machine and the rustle of fabric. He lifted his hand and knocked. The sound was a small drum in the night. The door opened a sliver. The jasmine-scented voice said, "Yes?" And the syllable that answered the knock unspooled like a ribbon in the dark. Imran's mouth formed the first words he had rehearsed. He stepped forward and saw at last, not a figure in shadow, but a face turned toward him. The light from the hallway spilled over features that were at once recognizable and mysterious. He felt, in the sudden intensity, the exact gravity of the moment. He was about to ask a question that could tilt the balance of something tender, and then, before he could speak, before he could introduce himself and fold his curiosity into sentences, something moved behind the person at the door. A flash of cloth, the faint sound of a small body taking a step, and the door shut enough that only a cool crack of darkness remained. His knuckles were still on the wood when a neighbor's shout rose somewhere down the lane. A child's voice, not part of his drama, shouting for a ball. The ordinary world intruded like the edge of a photograph. He could have kept banging. He could have called after the person. Instead, he stood there with his palm against the door, listening to the muffled house noise, wishing he had been quieter, wishing he had been less eager, less presumptuous. The mystery had reached a new pitch. He had been on the brink of crossing into someone else's life, and had been stopped by the smallest of interruptions. It was a cliffhanger that was intimate and gentle, the kind of pause that promises more if one is brave enough to wait, or bold enough to insist. He walked back into the lane, turned a corner, and, in the darkness, heard the soft tap of small paws. Nim brushed past his ankle, almost as if escorting him home. She paused and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold both the city's secrets and a caution he was not yet ready to heed. He stood there for a long time in the wake of that knock, and the city continued to move in its tireless, ordinary loop. He had been given an invitation, and also the clear sense that not all invitations are to be entered at once. For the first time, he understood that a mystery could be like a person who needs time to be ready for company. The pause was a living thing. It bided. He went home, the note in his pocket like a small furnace. The objects on his table, the button, the key, the ribbon, seemed to hum with possible meanings. He slept poorly, his dreams full of small hands tying twine and cats darting in and out of rooms with messages clutched in their teeth. The next morning, the towel he'd left at the foot of the bed bore no sign of cat hair. Nim had not slept on the bed. Instead, she left, as she had become wont to do, a new item at the door, a scrunched piece of paper towel with a smudge of black ink on the corner. On it was scribbled a number and a partial address. It was the first time a numeric sign had appeared within the offerings, and it landed in his hands with the clear force of possibility. He stared at the digits until they blurred. He could follow them. He could call. He could knock and demand admission. He could step carefully, and perhaps at the end of the careful steps there would be an answer that untangled the scattered pieces of a life. Or he could do nothing and let the pieces keep arriving, like petals on a path slowly revealing a face. He folded the paper and put it back into the envelope marked for Imran. He felt a strange reverence. The mystery had become a ledger of small trusts. He had been asked, in a manner that was almost ceremonial, to be a keeper of fragments, Each fragment demanded a decision. Each fragment had a moral weight. He stood at the balcony and watched the street. The market prepared for the day with the assured routine of vendors who had seen every kind of human drama. A child held a balloon, tightly. Someone laughed. The city breathed. Nim returned at evening, eyes bright with the satisfaction of a worker who'd done her rounds. She settled by his side, the tide of her small body against him like a seal. The wonder of it all was that the mystery had changed him into someone who wanted to do the right thing, who wanted to be gentle with secrets and brave enough to ask questions. He felt the courage of a person who would risk being rebuffed to give someone else the small dignity of being found. And yet, on the edge of that intention, the cliff waited. He had the partial address. He had a number and initials, and the marigold clutched in the box like a memory. He had followed enough to be certain of one thing. Nim was not merely a stray with loose habits. She was a bridge between a life concealed and a life that could be known. The moment before discovery is its own kind of music, a held chord. He had imagined asking for the name and receiving it, hearing a story that rounded like a coin. But he had not imagined being told to wait. The waiting hummed now in his chest like a second heartbeat. That night, he planned to go to the address on the paper. He imagined knocking at a door and hearing a voice speak the cat's name. He imagined a small woman, perhaps older than he'd expected, perhaps younger, who had survived something and had found in a small animal a safe courier. He imagined answers that would settle the tight-throated questions he had been carrying. He imagined also that he might find nothing and have to live with the gentle ache of mystery. He folded his coat around him and left a small bowl on the threshold like a votive. The city had many faces at night. It had tonight the face of possibility. He walked the streets with the slowness of a man stepping toward something tender and dangerous at once. At the corner where the lane split and the white door waited, he paused. It was a small, ordinary pause, like the one that comes before you say something important to someone you love. He lifted his hand to knock. The scene that had stopped him before replayed in his mind. The hand with the beads, the scent of jasmine, Nim's soft trills. He knocked. A sound came from inside, not the gentle murmur of a sewing machine, but a sharper, practiced sound, the click of a latch, the rasp of movement. The door opened, and he saw, framed by the thinner light of a lamp, a hand reaching out. Imran's breath caught. He stepped forward, and before the world could complete its small rotations, he realized the hand was not empty. It held something, small and squared in paper. It held unmistakably a tiny folded note waved like an offering. He had stepped into the hinge of something. The note in that hand could be an answer. It could be a refusal. It could be a line that would pull a life, into light or into further shadow. He reached forward, and at that precise instant, when the night's quiet felt full of consequence, a sound rose behind him. The bark of a distant dog, sharp and unexpected. The door clicked, and the space between them condensed into a single breath. The hand in the doorway lifted and then lowered. The lamp's light flickered, and the person behind the threshold slipped back as if recalled by some private rule. The door closed the rest of the way. Imran stood there, heart loud in the hush, a stick of small stars fizzing behind his eyes. He had almost opened the last fold. He had almost been given whatever answer lay behind the cat's offerings. Instead, The door had shut with the soft finality of a book closing. He knew he could knock again. He knew he could make a scene. He also knew the subtle ethical weight of insisting on answers that were not freely offered. He folded his hands and turned away, the digits on the scrap of paper like a compass he had not yet learned to use. The area Cliff waited. He had stepped so close he could feel the heat of the other side. He had almost been allowed in. The city resumed its ordinary noises. Someone sweeping, someone calling for chores, the distant rumble of transport. Nim brushed past his ankle, and for a second he wanted to tell her everything he felt. The ache of questions, the need to know whether the person behind the door was safe, the fear that discovering the truth might break the fragile architecture of small kindnesses. He folded his fingers into his palms and promised himself that he would return the next night. He would be patient. He would be courteous. He would ask. He would find out. He did not know whether he was being brave or selfish. The mystery had turned from curiosity into obligation, and obligation has a strange sincerity. He walked home through streets that felt suddenly familiar in a new way. Nim led the way, tail held high as if proud of her role. The city had shifted, slighter now, newly intimate. Behind him, doors opened and shut in whispers. Ahead, the night held the promise of the next step. The cliffhanger was not loud. It rested in the soft shuttering of a door that might have opened completely if he had knocked differently, if he had asked with a different cadence, if he had been someone else. The moment was charged. The next choice would be his. He went back. The next night with the same careful plan he'd made a dozen times in his head. This time he did not hide. He walked up the lane with his hands in his pockets, a small paper packet of tea tied inside his coat like an offering for any warm hand that might open the door. The street smelled of frying onions and something sweet from a shop that made jalebi, late into the evening. A motorbike sputtered in the distance, and a shopkeeper swept under the light like he was erasing the day. The white door that had thwarted him before stood quiet at the end of the lane. The brass number caught the lamp's amber and threw it back like a signal. He paused a step away, the world narrowing to the scrape of his shoe and the soft domestic sound from inside. The rhythm of a sewing machine, a thread being drawn through. Cloth, the low hum of a tune that might have been a lullaby. Nim trotted beside him with that same steady, purposeful air she always had, as if she were the gatekeeper and he was only the guest. He knocked. The sound this time landed with less hesitation. The door opened almost immediately. The person who greeted him was not shrouded in shadow now. She came into the threshold in a wash of warm lamplight. Her face had lines like those of a quilt, small repeated marks of a life folded in on itself. There were gray threads in her hair, and her fingers bore the faint stains of dye and ink, the kind that belonged to a woman who had spent decades handling cloth and paper. She smiled in a way that suggested she had been expecting him to come, around sooner or later. "Imran," she said, and his name in her mouth landed like an old coin. There was an astonishment in it that made him step forward. It sounded like recognition and a taking of breath at the same time. He nearly said the wrong thing. He nearly launched into the prepared speech about curiosity and not wanting to intrude. Instead, something simpler rose up. "I came because of Nim," he said, "and because of a note." She nodded as if that made everything sensible. "Then you would be the man who leaves the bowl on the step," she said. "You feed her." He laughed, a sound suspended between embarrassment and relief. I thought I was the one who was getting taken care of, he admitted. She stepped aside. The doorway opened fully and he could see into the room. A small, neat apartment with bolts of fabric stacked against one wall, a sewing machine with old wear in the cast iron, a line of drying clothes across the ceiling like pennants. The place had the intimacy of someone who makes the world with their hands. A small radio hummed in the corner. The tenderness of the space hit him like a soft, precise thing. "Please come in," she said, voice careful and kind, as if approaching a precious object. Inside, she moved with an ease that came from lifelong habit, folding the corner of a blue cloth as if smoothing away his wrinkles. Nim slipped in ahead of him and went straight to a low stool near the machine. She dropped something at the woman's feet, a ribbon he recognized from the pile of offerings, the one the nurse wore in her hair. The woman picked it up like someone opening a letter. "You named her?" she asked him, and the tone made the name feel sacred, as if it confirmed a fact that had been true for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Nim." "No wonder," she said, and her mouth twitched. "Nim. The one who remembers." There was a 1-second pause. He felt something, like air being rearranged. The woman, Anissa, he learned her name then, when she offered it as if it were a small present, had eyes that both examined and forgave. When she spoke, her voice was the kind that had been practiced at lowering things into people's laps, at telling painful truths with a measure so small they did not cut. "You've been bringing things back," she said, and there was no accusation in the phrase. It was a statement of fact, a naming of habit. He set the packet of tea on the small table like a conciliatory peace offering. "She leaves them on my step," he said. "Buttons, ribbons, a key once, an envelope for me." He told her the story. The way one tells a story you are learning the edges of as you speak. The box, the marigold, the folded note with the single initial, the pile of small objects. He watched her face as he spoke, searching for a crack, a sign that he had misread. The world. She listened with a patient gravity. When he was finished, she folded her hands and made a sound that was half sigh, half laugh. "It is time, then," she said. "It is about time, you know." Her voice slid open a thread he had been tugging at for weeks. Imran felt both a rush of triumph, he had found the hinge of the story, and a deeper apprehension, as if he was about to read a private letter aloud and find himself chastened. Anissa put the ribbon she held back in her pocket and crossed the room toward a small, wooden chest under the window. She unlocked it with a key that looked like it had been used for 100 years. The smell that rose from inside the chest was of old paper and cardamom, a domestic smell that made his chest clench. She lifted from it a carefully wrapped parcel and brought it to him with hands that trembled very slightly. "This was left for you," she said, and there was a soft finality to how she spoke the words. The parcel was the same box he had opened that morning, the same matchbox-sized piece of wood wrapped in cloth. He held it as if holding a fragile truth. It felt heavier now, as if the knowledge of what it might contain had given the object. "Wait! You found it?" Anissa asked. She watched him open it the way a person watches a photograph develop. He untied the twine with slow fingers. The cloth whispered and fell away. Inside was the folded square of paper and the dried marigold dust he remembered, and beneath them, tucked like a secret, a small locket. It was not ornate. It was a simple oval of tarnished gold with a tiny clasp. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips as he opened it. Inside was a photograph. Not a sliver this time. Not a corner. A whole photograph, faded around the edges but intact. It showed a woman sitting on a low step with a small boy in her lap. The boy's face, when his eyes adjusted, made his breath stop. The child was him. The impossible clue of a childhood chin and the tilt of an ear he had always suspected mirrored his own. He had not seen this photograph in his life, and yet some small muscle in his chest recognized the curl of his mouth. The woman in the photograph was younger than his memory of his mother, but the eyes were the same, patient, bright, and full of small surprises. There was a softness in the mother's smile that he had seen only in old family albums. He could not speak at first. The room contracted and held only the low sound of the sewing machine and the soft breathing of the two of them and Nim rubbing against the woman's ankle. Anissa watched him with a gravity that made him feel unpeopled in the best possible way. Witnessed. Seen. "She asked me to keep this," Anissa said, and her voice was a thing that made the world tilt slightly toward truth. "Years ago, before you were left in the rooms that have no clocks, she said, if he ever needs to find me, give him this." She asked me to keep it until the day a stranger with a bowl would notice the cat. Imran's chest contracted in a way that made it hard to breathe. He thought of his mother, of the small rituals she had left him, the way she dried dishes, the patchwork towel that always smelled faintly of cardamom, the nightlight she left in the kitchen. He had defended himself with work and schedules, endless after she died. No one had given him anything to hold that said plainly, "I thought you might need me later." "Why you?" he whispered, because the question was both simple and unbearable. "Why would she leave this with you?" Anissa took a breath. Her hands folded around a cup of tea she poured for both of them. The steam lifted between them like a map of the past. "We were young," she said, and for a moment it was as if pages of an old book unfurled, the kind with brittle edges and generous margins. "She and I sat on this very step. She offered me bread when I had none. We promised to keep one. Another's things safe because the city takes what it wants. She told me, if anything comes, you will know what to do. She left this with me because she said, you know me. You will know what I would want." The humility of the confession made him ache. He saw his mother, not as the myth he had built around absence, but as someone who had thought ahead in a gentle, deliberate way for her son's slow nights. There was an ordinariness to it that was almost unbearable. She had anticipated his grief and set a small trap for solace. "Why the cat?" he asked, because the question wanted the specific thread that connected the box to the creature outside, who had turned the neighborhood into a postal network of love. Anissa's hands tightened on the cup. "She took care of Nim when the rain came," she said. "When she was not well and could not cook, she left food in the stairwell and Nim would come. Nim learned to go where you could find people who needed the smallest kindnesses. When I could not go to her house, I was needed elsewhere and I had foolish pride. Nim listened." She looked at him now with something like apology folded into the fabric of her face. "When I could not bring myself to come to ask you, I used the thing we had. Nim. She remembers. She is very good at remembering." He felt the stitches in the world pull a little tighter. The pattern resolved with the grace of something designed to comfort. His mother had not vanished into silence because she had nothing to say. She had, in her way, left him a map. She had trusted someone, a friend with a chest of old letters and a willingness to be awkward with grief, to hold that map until the day it was needed. Told you to wait until I found you, Anissa said, and somewhere in the quiet of the room her voice carried the kind of humor that made sorrow less solitary. She was always cautious. She wanted to make sure whoever found it was ready. She would have liked the fact that you were cooking on the balcony. Imran laughed, a thin sound. It cracked into something like a sob. He had been waiting to be found, but he had also been waiting to understand why. The locket in his hand felt like a small, dense planet. He closed it and opened it again, and the photograph spilled like light across his palms. You should know, Anissa continued, that she used to tell me about your stubbornness. She would laugh and say, "Make sure you return it to him when he is ready to stop being brave for a living." She smiled with a mixture of mischief and sorrow. She was very clever. This was the moment where the cliff gave way. The small gash in his chest, the place grief had carved thin, made room for something softer. The knowledge that his mother had, in the practical way women often have, made preparations for the day he might be lonely, felt like a warm hand pressing against his sternum. He felt rage and gratitude and a fierce, tender relief all at once. Tears came then, sudden and hot. He did not try to hide them. He let them fall. Anissa reached out with a movement as sure and human as catching a falling cup and put her hand on his. The room narrowed to the contact of fingers and the cat on the stool rubbing her head against Anissa's knee. Nim's purr thrummed through the floor like a small engine. The sound itself became a kind of prayer. You waited a long time to give it, Imran said when he could speak again. It was a small reproach and a question folded together. He had imagined all sorts of explanations for Anissa's absence. Illness, poverty, estrangement. He had not expected the simplicity of a promise kept in private. I had my reasons, she said softly. There was a time I could not bear to cross certain thresholds. There were things I was ashamed of. I thought I would come when the world felt less sharp. Then time happens and you collect regrets like dust. I have been proud and painfully small. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that I would find redress in the quiet. Her hands fluttered as if dispelling a heavier confession. But Nim wouldn't let me keep it to myself. She kept bringing me things, and then she stopped. I thought it meant you had been found by luck. The city moves, people move. Then one morning she came with a scrap that had your initial on it. I understood. He listened and let the story settle. The ache in him did not leave, it rearranged. There was space now for gratitude that was edged with the small sting of abandonment. He thought of nights he had sat alone, thinking he had been left without ceremony. He imagined his mother folding this photograph with a care that made him feel seen in a way words in the world had not done. Why tie it to her collar? He asked. Why not come to the door? Anissa's laugh here was a small, vulnerable sound. Because you know how the world is, she said. Because my knees do not remember the steps like they used to. Because pride makes fools of us, and because somehow the cat is braver than I am. She is a bridge. She remembers the places the rest of us forget to go. She can cross fences that a woman with a past cannot. He wanted to ask more about the life she had lived, about the things she had kept for him. He wanted to know why she had waited and what else had been tangled in the years between the photograph and the present. He wanted to know the small mechanics of how the cat had been trained to move things, and whether Nim had chosen his door because his mother had left food for her. The questions crowded like birds. But what rose first, and with such intensity, it felt like an explosion inside the chest, was simple and raw gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The words were small, ordinary, but they held the weight of many things. For keeping it, for bringing it. She nodded with a soft, almost shy dignity. "For watching her," she said, "for doing that, and for the bowls." They sat with the little domestic sounds, the sewing machine ticks, the clatter of an old radio, Nim's purr, and the space between them softened into something like belonging. Anissa told him more. She told him how his mother had helped her when she first came to the neighborhood, how she had given her a single meal and a straw mattress for a night, how she had taught her to fold a sari into neat quarters. She spoke of small kindnesses as if they were currency that paid for everything that mattered. "You should know," Anissa said, and the sentence made him sit forward. "Your mother was careful with secrets. She believed in small gifts left for later. She told me once, if the son needs me in the future, he will know. He will find the seams." She made me promise. The seams. The thought lodged in him like a seed. His mind, exhausted and raw, suddenly understood that the small objects Nim had been bringing, the button, the ribbon, the key, were not random. They were stitches. They were pieces of a whole cloth that his mother had sewn and scattered across the city like a map. The marigold, the photograph, the note. They were all part of a careful design to make a person re-enter the world after a loss without falling through the cracks. He finally understood the shape of the gift. It was not the locket alone, or the photograph, or the cryptic note. It was an architecture of small things that collectively said, "You are remembered. You are not entirely alone." He felt the ground under his feet change. The world that had been so certain of his solitude shifted, made less stark by the accumulation of someone else's small, brave actions. The grief that had lodged like a stubborn stone in his throat softened into something more porous. He could feel an ache, yes, but it was a tender ache, like the one that tells you you've been seen. Anissa rose then and fetched a small envelope from her drawer. She handed it to him with both hands. "There's more," she said. "There's a set of letters. I thought you might prefer to read them in your own time." When he opened the envelope later that night in his apartment, he found pages folded with deliberate care. Letters his mother had written and entrusted to Anissa with instructions for the day they might be needed. There were small observations, recipes, a note about how to mend a torn sleeve, and a paragraph that read, "If you ever feel small, remember the places you were loved. Bring tea, lean into light, forgive yourself for being human." It was banal and precise, and exactly what he had wanted and not known how to ask for. The emotional release that followed was not cinematic in the way movies would stage it. There was no sweeping music. Instead, there was the quietness of someone being given permission to grieve and to be held while they do so. He slept that night with the locket on the bedside table, the photograph pressed against his palm like a talisman. Nim curled at his feet and purred in a way that vibrated the floorboards. But the peak was not only in the revelation of the locket. The peak came when, later that evening, as sparks of tear fog still fogged his vision, Anissa rose and set a small bowl of tea on his table, and without a fuss, sat down across from him like she belonged. Nim leapt into both their laps at once, as if diplomacy were one of her talents, and pressed her head into Imran's palm and then into Anissa's knee, mending distances with the simple gravity of a feline. Anissa put her hand on his and squeezed, a small human thing. "She said to give you this when you needed it," she said, voice near to breaking and steady. "She wanted you to know she thought of you. She thought of the ways light changes, and she thought you would miss it." He understood then all at once what he had been missing. It was not grand answers. It was not a tidy expression that would undo months of sleeplessness. It was the simple, incontrovertible knowledge that his life was threaded through with others, that people kept small promises for one another, that these promises arrive late sometimes, and they still count. He saw with sudden clarity that grief had not been an accusation of being unloved, but a slow erosion of tangible presence, and now presence had, in the strangest, gentlest way, been restored. He thought of the way Nim had walked into his doorway, every evening, like someone with an appointment with fate. He thought of how a creature who carried the city in its fur could be the instrument of reunion. He thought of Anissa's quiet bravery, how she had stooped to the smallest practicalities of care, and in doing so had kept a human tether intact. The cat nudged the locket with her paw as if to confirm its legitimacy. Imran laughed through tears and with a kind of clumsy reverence, closed the locket and held it to his chest. It felt like a small private coronation. He put his head down for a moment against the sleeve of his sweater and let the minute, muffled noises of the room press into him. The stitch of cloth, the whisper of fabric, a distant motorbike. He breathed in the jasmine that hung in the air and let himself accept the fact of being held. In the dawn's thin light, as they all sat together, a man, an old woman, and the small animal who had turned the city into an archive of remembrance, the understanding that Imran could not see before seeped in like warmth through a cracked window. He understood that family is not only blood and presence. It can be the sum of small promises kept by strangers who once ate bread from the yai. Same plate. He understood that love often prepares in small increments for the day sorrow arrives, and that these preparations are acts of incredible tenderness. It was a comprehension that arrived not with thunder, but with the clear, inevitable hush that follows. He understood that his mother had not simply disappeared into absence without thought. She had expected him to feel lost and had tried, in the only way she knew, to leave him breadcrumbs. He understood that the cat, the alley, the folded note, and the chest of letters were all part of an architecture designed to bring him back to himself. He finally saw in the round how much the world was built on small courtesies, how those courtesies could stitch a life back together even when larger systems of comfort failed. It was a truth that taught him how to grieve differently, how to forgive, and how to accept help when it came in odd shapes. That was the moment he finally understood something he couldn't see before. The days that followed the revelation were not cinematic. They were practical. They were cups of tea, and the small, steady labor of being human in a city that does not pause. But those practical things, when done again and again with attention, became a different kind of miracle. Imran read his mother's letters slowly, a paragraph a morning like a ritual. He kept them in the locket only sometimes. More often he spread them on the small table by the window where light could touch the paper, and he read aloud to himself while Nim slept on the Sil and Anissa sewed on the other side of the room. The letters were generous and ordinary. Instructions on how to fold a paratha so it did not fall apart, a recipe for lentils that needed no measuring spoon, a note on how to ask for help without feeling like a burden. There were names of neighbors, a few small household tricks, and a paragraph that said bluntly and without ostentation, "When you feel lost, make tea. Then offer it to someone else." He started making tea in the mornings as if it were a duty. He boiled the kettle and watched how steam rose, the way sunlight pooled on the saucer. Sometimes he poured 2 cups and left one on Anissa's step. She answered by sewing extra hours into the afternoon so she could come down and sit with him, her radio tucked under her arm like an instrument. The rhythm of their afternoons became an unremarkable temple. The sewing machine, the click of a spoon against the cup, Neem slipping between them like a small, content priest. He had known for weeks that he had a choice about the job abroad. The job offer was not sudden now, a contract he could sign and be gone in a month, but a possible way off the map, a clean rectangle of money and distance. He sat at the table and weighed it against a stack of envelopes that once belonged to someone who thought that small things mattered. The letters taught him a kind of anchoring. They taught him that presence could be a work of art. The answer arrived quietly. He told his manager he needed more time. He asked for a deferred start. The company, made of other ordinary people, said yes. It was not dramatic. It was a management email, a concession. But for him, it was a turning point, a choice to stay long enough to make gentleness into habit, rather than a brief interlude. He did not decide against moving forever. He decided to stay until the season turned and the marigolds bloomed on his balcony. The balcony became a small garden. He planted marigold seeds in the same pot where he had kept basil. The packet of seeds came from Anissa, who produced it like one produces an heirloom. She said nothing about symbolism, but when the first green broke through the dark soil, they both stood in the warm afternoon and watched like 2 people who had been given permission to be tender. Nim patrolled the pots as if inspecting work, sitting in the sun and casting long, approving shadows. Neighbors noticed the change. The nurse, upstairs, began to leave a tin of biscuits on the stair landing. The old man with the cough waved more often from his window. The boy from the courtyard began to bring stray leaves for Nim to chase. People who had once been extras in Imran's life became part of the scenery. They began to be fixtures. The apartment that had felt like a place of retreat transformed into a small junction, a place where visitors stopped for tea and left stories behind. Imran started a small habit. Each evening he left 2 bowls by the door. One was for Nim and one was for whoever else might need it. Sometimes it was a stray dog. Sometimes it was an old woman with a paper bag of rations who paused on her way home. The bowl was both a tool and a message. It said plainly, "I notice you." The measure of smallness in that bowl was huge. He learned the difference between charity and neighborliness. The former is a one-way transaction. The latter is an invitation to sit down and share. He also wrote back. Not to anyone who might read the letters, not to a ghost, but to his mother. He folded loose sheets and wrote small entries, an inventory of his days and the oddities that filled them. A note on how Nim had dumped a pile of ribbon across his floor, a comment about Anissa's uncanny way of mending frayed cuffs, a line about the first real laugh he had heard in months. He kept the letters in a drawer beside the locket. They were a private covenant. He would leave nothing unsaid twice. Writing became the vessel through which he made things whole. There was work to do in the neighborhood beyond cups of tea. The small rituals of tending became practical offerings. Streets needed clearing after rains. A broken latch on a neighbor's door needed mending. Imran learned to fix a leaky pipe with instructions half remembered from childhood and half read from a page Anissa had marked. He spent a morning at the market with the watch repairer, learning how to select strong thread and how to knot it so it would not give out. He brought his mending skills home and took shirts with ragged sleeves to Anissa. She taught him how to stitch by hand, how to press seams until they lay like a polite promise. At first he thought he was doing these things because the letter said to offer help. Later he understood he was doing them because it felt good to be useful in a way that cost him no bravado. Usefulness was different from utility. It was a way of participating in other people's days without trying to solve what could not be fixed. Nim's work changed too. The small cascade of objects at his doorstep did not stop, but its tenor shifted. The items became less like evidence of a private life and more like a communal thread. A child's missing wristband one day, a neatly folded handkerchief another, a small set of keys that reunited a vendor with his old lock. Nim's offerings began to be returned to their rightful owners with a quiet choreography. She would leave a thing on Imran's step, he would ask around, and soon enough the owner appeared, with breathless gratitude. The neighborhood in turn began to rely on the oddity of a cat run lost and found. People started to call her the little remembrancer when they meant to be poetic. Other times they simply said Nim and meant the same thing. Anissa became a friend, in the way that only long, careful proximity can build. A slow accumulation of practical confidences and shared humor. She taught Imran to fold a sari neatly in 3 short motions. He taught her how to use a thermostat he had never owned before. They traded recipes and secrets, and the rhythm of that exchange made both of them less lonely. Once, when a small fight with a courier service set his temper alight, Anissa offered tea and a firm, no-nonsense plan for the next steps. Her logic was small and perfect. It grounded him. He marveled at how the people who stay in neighborhoods have the capacity to stitch lives back together without fuss. The letters continued to offer small wisdom. One line suggested that if he ever wanted to feel better on hard mornings, he should make a list of 3 things he could do that day to be kind to someone else. He did this and found that it rewired him. Kindness became a daily task like washing the dishes, an act as ordinary and restorative as boiling water. Then, some weeks later, Nim arrived one morning with something different at her collar. It was not what she had been leaving before. She came in at the end of the afternoon, a small dusted bundle swinging at her throat. He unwrapped it on the table with a careful hand that had learned to treat surprises gently. Inside was a single wooden disc, worn smooth by years of being held, with a shallow carving on one side, a small marigold. At first he thought it might be a toy or a lost pendant. Then he saw, etched in faint script around the edge, the words, "For the garden, from A." The marigold image looked like a full stop at the end of the letter's sentences. He held the disc in his palm and felt its small gravity. It was a final touch to a long design. He placed it in the soil, between the basil and the small, green sprout of marigold that had already begun to show leaves. It was a ritual as plain as watering. He pressed the disc in and covered it with earth like someone burying a letter that is not meant to be read, but to be felt. Seasons turned. The marigolds came up in orange ribbons, and the balcony smelled of summer. The flower heads opened like small suns, and Nim slept among them sometimes, orange petals clinging to her whiskers. The sight of the blooms made him weep again, but not with the ache of absence this time. These were different tears. They tasted of belonging. He felt held by something beyond his own striving, by a line of small acts that threaded past and present, by a network of neighbors, and by an animal that had decided to bring the city into alignment. At the edge of the balcony, Nim shifted and looked at him with those coin-bright eyes that had started this whole gentle revolution. For a moment, he felt like a man who had been given back not only a memory, but a method, a set of small things he could do every day to cultivate a life that would be worth leaving letters for. The neighborhood did not change overnight. It became kinder in ways both small and steady. People looked out for one another. They would catch a parcel for a neighbor, bring an extra cup of tea when someone seemed quiet, sweep the stairwell with a little more care. The seed of one returned locket had grown into a hedge of attentiveness. The city, which rarely rewards, quiet, rewarded their care with a different currency. A sense of community that felt like a rescued room. Months later, as the second season of marigolds began to sleep into bulbs, Imran stood at his window and watched Nim walk down the lane, tail high like a standard. He felt the tug of the job he had deferred, a faint pressure still there like a tide. He would leave one day, perhaps. He would carry with him what he had learned, that the small rituals are the architecture of the good life, and that leaving does not erase the habit of care. For now, he stayed. For now, there were letters and a chest and a woman who sewed and a cat who collected the city's smallest truths. On quiet nights, he would lace his fingers together and say aloud what he had once whispered only to himself. Thank you. Sometimes he would say the words to Anissa, sometimes to Nim, sometimes to the photograph of his mother tucked in the locket. Saying the words made them real. It made him a receiver as well as a giver. The final scene is not a tidy bow, but a particular, stubborn kind of light. Imran built his life not by grand gestures, but by the careful repetition of small acts. He kept the envelope labeled "For Imran" in the chest sometimes, and sometimes he took it out and read it to anyone who wanted to listen. He taught the boy from the courtyard to sew a patch, and the boy taught him how to whistle a tune that could call little birds. The small things braided together into a thicker cord of belonging that held them all. There is a truth here that feels like a soft secret. Second chances are often not thunderous returns. They are quiet. They are patient. They arrive in the cadence of a cat's steps, in the stitch of a seamstress's needle, in the willingness of a stranger to keep a promise. They arrive when someone ties a note to a collar and trusts that others will notice. The last lingering gift, the one that remained after seasons had shifted and the marigolds had seeded themselves into the soil again, was not the locket, or the photograph, nor the chest of letters, nor even the little wooden disc with the etched marigold. It was the change inside him, a softness that allowed him to receive help without shame, to offer it without grandstanding, to believe that people will sometimes be there when you need them, even when they arrive in the shape of a cat. He had thought he wanted answers. In the end, what he received was more useful. A set of relationships that made room for his grief and invited him to keep living while he mourned. The city had given him back his history in small increments, and in return, he gave the city his care. There is a final thing to say, as delicate and necessary as a closing hand on a book. The world is built of small commitments. They do not make headlines. They make lives. The cat that came back with a tiny box tied to her collar had, in truth, been offering him an education in what it means to be held. She taught him that trust can be ordinary and that gifts often arrive in modest packages. She taught him to wait and to act, to listen and to be seen. It was not the revelation of who had once been lost that changed the man most. It was the accumulation of soft, steady moments, a bowl left out for a stranger, a letter read aloud, a marigold planted and tended, a neighbor helped with a leaky tap. The last gift was the life he built in response to what had been entrusted to him. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.